Hey guys, tonight we are lying 6 feet under. Or at least, we think we are. Your eyes are closed. Your body is cold. There's a heavy silence pressing in from all sides. And then, your eyelid twitches. Maybe it's just a dream. Or maybe, just maybe, you're not as dead as everyone thought. Welcome to the chilling, confusing, and occasionally hilarious history of what happened when people woke up inside their own wakes. And heads up, you probably won't survive this. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're feeling brave or sleepy, drop your location and local time in the comments so we can all feel a little less alone. Or at least know who not to bury too early. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You lie there, still as stone. People are crying around you, which is flattering. But no one's checking your pulse too closely. No one's putting a mirror under your nose. It's the 1700s, and medicine is more vibes than science. If you looked dead, you were dead. The bar was low, and unfortunately, so was your body, inside a wooden box, waiting for the earth to close over it. Premature burial wasn't just a nightmare. It was policy. Buried alive sounds like a modern horror trope, but back then, it was more like a monthly worry. People had reasons to panic. Records from the 18th and 19th centuries are full of people who were buried, only to later be discovered, slightly too well preserved. Scratch marks on coffin lids. Bodies twisted awkwardly. Eyes wide open. Not exactly restful. One story from Germany tells of a woman named Margaretha who was buried during a cholera scare. You know, back when everyone was like, better safe than sorry, but forgot to check for breath. Days later, her grave was reopened, for some grim reason we won't ask about, and there she was, turned over, with torn fingertips and a face full of sheer panic. Not exactly the peace one hopes for in eternal slumber. This fear wasn't just whispered between townsfolk, it was institutionalized. Some cities required a waiting period between death and burial, just in case someone decided to pop back in for one last breath. They called it the watch. As in, let's watch this body for a few days to make sure it doesn't do anything suspicious. Imagine your last chance at life, depending on some sleepy old uncle not dozing off during his shift. Even Edgar Allan Poe was obsessed with the idea. In his story, The Premature Burial, the protagonist becomes convinced he's been buried alive, and loses his mind trying to prevent it. Poe knew the fear was real. Some scholars even suggest he may have witnessed or read about true cases where people were entombed before their time. Of course, there were skeptics. Surely this never actually happened, they said, while totally ignoring all the coffins with built-in breathing tubes. But let's not forget, these were the same people who thought leeches could cure migraines. Confidence wasn't always backed by competence. And yet, part of the fear came from just how quiet it was in the coffin. There's no banging on the lid, no horror movie screaming. You wake up groggy, disoriented, probably still drunk on whatever 19th century potion they gave you. The air is thin. Your arms are pinned. You cough, but it's muffled by wood and dirt. No one hears. You are absolutely not the main character in this story. You're just a plot twist for the gravedigger who finds you days later. But here's where it gets even darker. Some people didn't mind this fear. In fact, they leaned into it. Early horror novels, penny dreadfuls, even news pamphlets would sell better if they included a buried alive scene. It became a kind of macabre marketing tool. Nothing moves newspapers like the idea that you might not actually be dead. Historically, though, the panic wasn't universal. In places like ancient Rome or medieval Japan, the rituals around death included days or even weeks of ceremonial preparation. just enough time to realize if the guest of honor started coughing. Other cultures built in safeguards almost accidentally, with long waits before burial or multi-stage funerals. Ironically, it was modern societies, those proud of their scientific progress, that streamlined the process so much, they forgot to wait and see if the corpse wasn't. And the fringe detail? Okay, buckle up. Some doctors believed that gases inside a dead body could make it sit up or twitch. So when Aunt Gertrude suddenly raised an arm mid-wake, people didn't check her pulse. They just ran screaming and nailed the coffin shut faster. You know, just in case. Historians still argue whether certain high-profile figures were ever really dead when buried. Take Zeno of Elea, a Greek philosopher who allegedly bit off his own tongue and choked to death in protest. Some scholars think he actually faked the whole thing to escape execution, or at least went out more dramatically than needed. As we tiptoe further into this shadowy corner of history, remember, it wasn't always negligence. Sometimes it was sheer terror. Doctors, family, clergy, they all feared being wrong more than being cautious. Better to bury too soon than risk the awkwardness of saying, "Oops, false alarm," at a dinner party. So tonight, as you lie there cozy under your blanket, remember, at least your bed isn't filled with dirt. And if you wake up tomorrow with claw marks on your headboard, well, you've been warned. Also, next time someone says, "They look so peaceful," maybe give them a nudge, just to be sure. So, here you are, still not dead. But back in the day, that would have been more of a medical grey area than a certainty. Imagine lying motionless in a cold room, eyes shut, barely breathing. You've had a long illness, maybe a fever, or you just fainted after a little too much opium-laced cough syrup. The town doctor shows up, peeks at you over his monocle, and in his highly educated opinion announces, "Yep, definitely deceased. No stethoscope. No brain scans. Just vibes." Let's take a leisurely stroll through how hilariously bad early death diagnosis used to be. First of all, doctors thought if your body went cold and stiff, that was all the evidence they needed. Never mind that rigor mortis isn't exactly exclusive to the afterlife. You could have been in a diabetic coma, in shock, even just really, really asleep. But hey, if you weren't paying rent on your breathing, they assumed it was curtains for you. There's this delightful little slice of history where people believed mirrors were high-tech diagnostic tools. They'd hold a small mirror under your nose to see if it fogged up. If not, boom, you're gone. Sounds legit, until you realize that technique doesn't work in humid climates, windy rooms, or, if someone has shallow breaths. It's like deciding whether someone's alive based on whether your glasses fog when you hug them. And if the mirror test failed, don't worry. They had other methods. Some would shout in your ear, waiting for a wince. Others pinched your toes, poured vinegar on you, or, in one charmingly medieval method, burned your foot. Because nothing says medical expertise like trying to cremate someone just to be sure they're not faking it. It gets better. In 1903, a French doctor named Paul Brouardel actually banned the immediate certification of death because too many people were waking up mid-funeral. Let that sink in. The problem wasn't hypothetical. It was happening often enough that a law had to be made. You know it's bad when the government steps in to say, "Guys, stop burying people who are still blinking." But how did this even become a thing? Part of it lies in how people saw consciousness. Back then, your soul was either home or it wasn't. No concept of brain activity or oxygen levels. If you weren't up and talking, they assumed you'd clocked out permanently. That's not medicine. That's guessing with confidence. And in case you're wondering how fringe this all got, there's one account from 19th century India where a local holy man was declared dead, buried, and then, days later, dug up on purpose by his followers, who found him alive and very annoyed. He'd allegedly entered a deep meditative trance. Now, is that true? Historians are split. Some think it's exaggerated myth. Others believe it's possible he slowed his breathing to nearly nothing, like some yogic hibernation. Either way, imagine waking up and seeing someone pulling the lid off your coffin like it's just another Tuesday. Here's the kicker. Many of these dead folks didn't realize they were at their own funerals until they heard sobbing, or started suffocating. Their first moments of post-fake death life were often pure confusion. One woman in 1851 reportedly sat up in her coffin during the church service. Her family screamed. The priest fainted. And she politely asked for tea. Not to be outdone, there was a Spanish countess in the 1600s who was entombed in her family crypt. A few days later, grave robbers broke in hoping to steal her jewelry. When they tried to cut a ring off her finger, she woke up. So, ironically, crime saved her life. Insert your favorite. That's what she gets for flaunting the diamonds joke here. What makes this topic so deeply absurd is how nonchalant people were about it. You'd think a single premature burial would cause a mass panic, but instead, it became folklore. Ghost stories, superstitions. People chalked it up to divine will or bad luck. One newspaper from 1838 even advised readers to sleep with their hands crossed, just in case they were mistaken for corpses in the middle of the night. Because, folded hands mean peace. Open hands, zombie alert. Of course, some places took a more proactive approach. In parts of Italy and France, they'd tie a string to the corpse's hand and connect it to a bell above ground. If the bell rang, well, someone had unfinished business. It wasn't foolproof. Sometimes the wind or shifting dirt would cause false alarms, leading to gravediggers cursing the ghost who wouldn't let them nap. But these weren't just kooky traditions. They reflected genuine terror. The line between life and death was so blurry that people built their entire mourning culture around not being sure. And it didn't help that doctors were basically doing their best with zero tools. Imagine diagnosing someone based on whether their ears looked too pale. And that was the advanced approach. One mainstream medical idea that now seems laughable was the concept of suspended animation. Some physicians believed people could enter a death-like state during trauma or illness, and later return to life spontaneously. Sound ridiculous? Sure. But it also kind of makes sense when you remember they'd seen it happen, just with no idea why. Some modern scholars even debate whether these early cases were misidentified comas or episodes of catalepsy, a condition where the body becomes rigid and unresponsive. Either way, they didn't have CAT scans. They had candles and guesswork. All of this makes you appreciate how far we've come. Today, we have machines that can measure the brain's tiniest electrical signals, pulse monitors that light up like Christmas trees, and emergency defibrillators in every shopping mall. You can be clinically dead and brought back within minutes. Though, fair warning, don't try this recreationally. So next time you wake up groggy from a nap, just be glad you're not in a pine box under 6 feet of soil, with a questionable priest insisting you're in a better place. And as for those mirror tests, maybe keep one around. Not because they work, but because if someone starts waving one near your mouth, you'll know you've got bigger problems. You're laying in your bed, warm and safe. But let's slide back into the 1800s. When people were so scared of being buried alive, they started inventing gadgets to prevent it. Welcome to the era of the Victorian safety coffin, also known as the greatest overreaction in history that somehow wasn't an overreaction at all. Picture this. You're wealthy, probably named something like Archibald Thistlethwaite III, and you've just recovered from a serious fever. Naturally, you spend your recovery designing a coffin with an escape hatch, because nothing says, "Good morning," like the fear of waking up surrounded by mahogany and dirt. And that's not even the weirdest part. These inventions were real. Like, patent-approved real. Some included little bells on strings tied to the deceased's hand or foot, just in case there was some posthumous twitching. Others had flags that would pop out of the grave like a tiny semaphore for the undead. One even had a speaking tube. Yes, a literal tube from the coffin to the surface, so you could shout, "Hey, I was only mostly dead." Let's pause for a second. Who exactly was supposed to be hanging around the cemetery long enough to hear that? Imagine your job being the guy stationed near the graves, listening for flag pops and faint yelling. I mean, yes, it's better than being a chimney sweep, but still, hard to explain at dinner parties. This wasn't just a one-time invention spree. From the mid-18th to the late 19th century, more than 30 different patents for safety coffins were filed across Europe and the United States. That's a lot of panic engineering. And it wasn't fringe paranoia. Newspapers ran regular stories about people being exhumed in unsettling positions. The fear was so widespread, even normal people, i.e., not mad inventors, started requesting waiting mortuaries. What's a waiting mortuary, you ask? Oh, just a place where bodies were kept under surveillance for days, sometimes weeks, before burial. In Germany, these places came equipped with attendants whose full-time job was watching the dead, in case one sat up and asked for soup. They even used bells and mirrors in these waiting rooms. Can you imagine clocking in at your job and thinking, "Please don't let this be the day someone moves"? Of course, this led to other problems, like when a person did move, but it was just a muscle spasm, or gas, or honestly, a rat. Several waiting mortuaries had to develop policies about what qualified as actual life signs, so they didn't have a full-blown panic every time someone burped posthumously. Here's your odd historical tidbit of the night. One safety coffin design came with a small ladder. Just a tiny ladder, neatly stowed inside the coffin, because apparently people thought you could just climb your way out of 6 feet of packed soil. Cute idea. Totally impossible. But hey, when you're panicking, logic is optional. Some inventors even added food and water compartments in the coffin. Because yes, waking up underground is awful, but at least you've got a juice box and a granola bar to pass the time while you wait for rescue. One 19th century American patent even included an air pump and a flashlight. To be fair, batteries weren't great back then, so the flashlight probably lasted all of 10 minutes, but the idea was comforting. Still, not everyone thought this was genius. Many in the medical community rolled their eyes so hard they nearly fell over. They argued that these contraptions encouraged hysteria, and that the odds of premature burial were, in their eyes, exaggerated. Of course, most of these critics were also the same guys confidently diagnosing death using toe pinching. So maybe don't trust them with your final arrangements. There's a historical debate about whether safety coffins actually saved anyone. Most records of people waking up in coffins come from exhumations, not from someone yanking a flag or ringing a bell. Scholars still argue whether the safety coffin was an effective tool or just a Victorian placebo. Comforting, expensive, and utterly useless. Like the Apple Vision Pro, but for dying. But whether or not they worked, safety coffins sold. Funeral homes marketed them like life insurance, except for after you were dead. Rich people loved them. Some even bought them years before they needed them. It was a status symbol. You weren't just going to die. You were going to die prepared. Think of it as the luxury SUV of death tech. Even authors got in on the action. Poe wasn't alone. Mark Twain wrote about premature burial. So did Charles Dickens, who described it as a dread beyond all dread. Writers fed the fire of fear, and the public gobbled it up like a ghost-shaped marshmallow. Meanwhile, in the real world, folks began demanding changes to the entire burial process. Wakes were extended. Burials delayed. Family members insisted on testing the corpse with increasingly strange techniques, like sticking a pin under the toenail. If you didn't flinch, congrats, you were probably dead. One famous case involved a Hungarian woman named Margit, who insisted, on her deathbed, that she be buried with a bell and a long cord attached to her hand, just in case. Her family complied. The bell never rang. But the story lived on, passed from generation to generation as a kind of dark bedtime story. Don't worry, darling. We'll give you a bell too. Let's be honest, though. Some of these measures sound more like ways to soothe the living. It gave families peace of mind, a way to feel like they were doing something, anything, to avoid the worst. And if you're someone who'd rather sleep with the lights on, well, maybe a bell on your wrist doesn't sound so ridiculous. So tonight, as you drift off, maybe think about that tiny ladder, or the soft ring of a bell echoing from the dirt. Not because it'll happen to you, but because for a weird little moment in history, people thought it might. And they were willing to build entire contraptions just in case. It's both tragic and hilarious that humans, in their most panicked state, responded not with calm, scientific inquiry, but with engineering. Coffins with trapdoors, tubes, snack compartments, Victorian anxiety, wrapped in walnut wood and velvet lining. And if you ever feel like your own worries are overblown, just remember, someone once paid real money for a coffin with a breathing pipe, a bell, and a user manual. By now, you've probably realized that being buried alive wasn't just a fear. It was a full-blown societal event. But here's the question that keeps shuffling around in its own dusty grave. What actually happened when someone woke up inside their coffin? Let's get to the part where things go from creepy to downright tragic, and weirdly informative. So, say it's the 1840s. You're a cobbler. You've had a bad cough for days, passed out, and no one has seen you move since. Naturally, the town doctor, Dr. Soot and Blood, or whatever his actual name was, pokes you a few times, declares you dead, and within hours, you're nailed into a box and lowered into the earth with a modest amount of sorrow and absolutely 0-second opinions. But what happens next isn't darkness. Not yet. You wake up. It's pitch black. Your nose fills with the scent of pine and damp soil. Your chest is heavy, not with emotion, but because something is pressing down on it. Welcome to the horrifying phenomenon of the double death. Once from being mistaken as dead, and once from the panic and suffocation of being trapped in your own grave. In real, recorded cases, people who were exhumed days or even weeks later were found twisted around, mouths open in terror, nails torn from clawing at the inside of the coffin. One particularly awful account out of 19th century New Orleans describes a man found on his stomach, face buried in wood shavings, suggesting he'd flipped over in desperation. That's not horror fiction. That's paperwork filed by a very stressed undertaker. Why do we know these details? Because back then, if someone was exhumed for a legitimate reason, legal dispute, mistaken identity, relocating a grave, the condition of the body was often noted. And if that body didn't look peaceful, it raised questions. Was it decay? Or did someone really wake up and realize, far too late, that they weren't supposed to be there? Historians have documented dozens of these cases across Europe and North America. Some were flukes. People buried during cholera outbreaks or wars when bodies were piling up and no one had time to double-check anything. But others happened during quiet times, in small towns, to ordinary people. That's what made it so terrifying. It could happen to anyone. Now for the unusual twist. There's a theory among fringe scholars that some of these cases weren't actually premature burials, but deliberate murders. Think about it. Fake a death, declare someone gone, and bury them. All very officially. But really, they were just buried alive on purpose. There's no definitive proof, of course. It's speculative. But when you see enough scratch marks inside a coffin lid, you start to wonder whether someone had a bit more motive than just a mistaken diagnosis. And here's where things get bleak. Even if someone managed to ring a bell, scream into a pipe, or kick the lid, that didn't guarantee survival. In one documented case in France, a cemetery night watchman actually heard a bell ringing and ignored it because he thought it was wind or just the rats. That's not the most comforting job performance review. Later, when the grave was checked, they found the coffin scratched and broken from the inside. The person had died again, this time fully and officially, within reach of salvation. The death wasn't always quick, either. Depending on the coffin's seal and depth, you could remain conscious for minutes, even hours. One British doctor in the 1870s estimated that a buried adult, in a standard coffin, might survive for up to an hour before the air ran out. An hour. 60 minutes of pure, waking confusion and terror. That's enough time to regret all your life choices, and your death ones too. Now here's where it gets even more ironic. Some exhumations were carried out by people trying to prove that no one had ever been buried alive. These rationalists, as they were called, believed the whole panic was overblown. So they'd dig up recently buried corpses, inspect them, and publish papers claiming that all was well. That no one had moved. That people were just panicking over shadows. But in more than a few cases, those rationalists found things they couldn't quite explain. Lids cracked from the inside, finger bones out of place, chests caved in. Their conclusions? Let's just say they weren't quite as confident afterward. And here's tonight's scholarly debate. Were these post-burial shifts caused by premature burial or by decomposition? It's a hot topic in forensic anthropology. Some argue that gases inside the body can cause sudden, dramatic movements even days after death. Others suggest that soil pressure and collapsing coffins can jostle the corpse. But the counterpoint is, some bodies had clear signs of struggle. Deep scratch marks, torn skin, dislocated shoulders. Those aren't the symptoms of peaceful decay. One case from 1871 involved a man in upstate New York who was exhumed for a family reburial. When the coffin was opened, the man's face was frozen in an expression of terror. His hands were clawed at his throat, and the lid splintered from the inside. The local paper ran the story with the headline, "Dead, but not when we buried him. You can't make this stuff up." So what did society do with these horrifying discoveries? Well, not much. They buried the person again, properly this time, and whispered about it for years. Sometimes it made the local news. Other times it became legend. A cautionary tale. A reason to add one more bell to the coffin, just in case. And if you're wondering whether this still happens today, very rarely. Modern embalming, life support systems, and legal waiting periods have made premature burial almost impossible. Almost. But every so often, you hear a story. A man in Brazil who wakes up in the morgue. A woman in South Africa who starts breathing again after being zipped into a body bag. Flukes, yes, but not impossible. So tonight, as you lie there with your blanket tucked just right, think about how lucky you are to live in an age of heart monitors, brain scans, and people who generally check before they dig. Unless, of course, you're in a spooky story like this one. Then, well, maybe keep one ear open for the sound of soft fingernails against pine. By now, you're probably thinking, how did this keep happening? Didn't anyone check? Well, welcome to the part of our story where you realize just how tragically unqualified most historical doctors were at telling if someone was, alive. Tonight, we're strolling through the dimly lit corridors of pre-modern medicine, where death detection was more of an educated guess than an exact science. Let's start with the basics. Back in the 1700s and 1800s, there was no formal system for determining death. No national checklist. No certified test. In fact, being declared dead could happen for reasons as arbitrary as, "She's been very quiet today." Sometimes that worked. Other times, not so much. The most common method? You guessed it, the mirror test. Just hold a shiny little mirror under the person's nose and wait to see if it fogs. If it didn't, well, case closed. Unfortunately, this scientific marvel has the sensitivity of a potato. If you breathe shallowly, or the mirror is cold, or the room is breezy, you might not fog it at all. Add to that the lovely 19th century tradition of open-air parlours and unpredictable weather, and you've got a diagnostic tool that could barely detect a sneeze, let alone life. And if the mirror was inconclusive, time to move on to the candle trick. You hold a candle in front of the presumed dead's lips and watch for the flame to flicker. Spoiler alert, this also doesn't work if someone's barely breathing, or if they're passed out drunk on laudanum, which, by the way, was a common problem. And then there's the pinprick test. This is where things get pokey. The theory was simple. If someone was alive, they'd react to pain. So you jabbed a pin under their fingernail. Still nothing? Well, maybe try the toes. If they still didn't move, they were obviously deceased, or in shock, or unconscious, or a monk. Either way, someone's about to get a coffin. In more aggressive cases, they'd use heated metal. Yep, they'd literally burn you. One particularly popular tool was a red-hot poker pressed against the foot. Because who needs compassion when you've got third-degree burns? And if you did twitch, congratulations, you just got branded and saved from being buried alive. Win-win. Here's one of the strangest death tests ever devised: blowing tobacco smoke into the rectum. This was a real method. The idea was that the nicotine might stimulate breathing or cause some reaction. It was so common, they actually kept bellows in funeral parlors for this exact purpose. And you thought CPR was awkward. The fringe historical tidbit of this section? In 1752, a German physician named Christian Franz Pollini proposed the use of leeches to test for death. He'd place leeches on different parts of the body. If they reacted to blood flow or body heat, the patient might still be alive. And if the leeches weren't hungry, well, time to make arrangements. Some of these methods may sound absurd, but they were genuinely believed to be state-of-the-art at the time. Medical professionals, if you could call them that, believed they were doing their best. There were no EKGs, no EEGs, no way to measure brain activity. You had pulse and breath, and if both were faint or missing, your next stop was the pine box. But not everyone was so cavalier. Some doctors began pushing for stricter definitions of death. In the mid-1800s, a French doctor named Eugene Bouchet proposed using the stethoscope to listen for heartbeat over a period of several hours. His peers scoffed. Too cautious, they said. Imagine being criticized for waiting a little longer before burying someone. The horror. Then there were the overachievers. One British physician in 1846 wrote a 200-page manual on how to tell if someone was dead. It included tips like, watch the body for at least 6 hours, check for lividity and cooling, and don't rely on just one sign. Revolutionary advice, really. Unfortunately, few people read it. Why? Too long, too boring, too science-y. So back to the mirror and candle they went. And here's the open debate historians still argue over. Was the issue really ignorance, or was it cost and convenience? Some scholars believe people weren't that clueless. They just didn't have the time or resources to wait around. In plague-ridden towns or war zones, checking for signs of life wasn't a priority. You had dozens of bodies to handle, and fear of disease was stronger than compassion. If someone looked dead, you buried them. Fast. Sometimes within hours. But even in quieter times, Early burial was seen as an act of piety. Families wanted to send their loved ones off quickly, according to religious tradition. Judaism, Islam, and certain Christian sects emphasized speedy burials. Waiting around, just in case, was frowned upon. So the system leaned toward haste, sometimes fatally so. And then came the paranoia. Once stories of premature burial started circulating, often wildly exaggerated, they created a cultural feedback loop. People demanded better tests. Doctors invented weirder methods. Families added instructions to wills. Wait 72 hours. Stab me in the heart. Hang garlic just in case. The fear of not being dead enough became a psychological plague of its own. Let's take a moment to appreciate how far we've come. Today, we can confirm death using brain scans, heart monitors, and a whole panel of clinical tests. There are legal procedures in place. Multiple professionals must sign off before burial or cremation. The odds of being misdiagnosed as dead are microscopic. Still, we can't help but wonder how many people, quiet, breathless, unresponsive, were buried before their time. No twitch, no voice, just silence, and a doctor with a mirror. As you lie in bed tonight, wrapped in comfort and certainty, remember this: the line between life and death isn't as razor-sharp as it seems. It used to be a smudged, confused, trembling pencil mark. One gust of wind, and it disappeared. But you're fine. You've got a pulse, a fan humming softly in the corner, and no hot pokers anywhere near your feet. Lucky you. If you've stuck with me this far, and haven't already checked under your bed for bells, you're ready to meet one of history's most bizarre inventions, the safety coffin that actually saved lives. Or, at least tried to. Tonight, we're talking contraptions, cranks, and Victorian-era problem-solving at its absolute weirdest. It's time to get saved by the bell. And no, not the one with Zach Morris. So, rewind to the 1800s. We've established that people were terrified of being buried alive. This wasn't just a passing fear. It was an obsession. Enter a series of inventors, tinkerers, and aspiring escape artists who decided that the only way to deal with this fear was engineering. Their mission? Make sure no one, absolutely no one, stayed buried if they didn't want to be. The result was a parade of bizarre and brilliant devices collectively known as safety coffins. The premise was simple: give the not dead yet person a way to communicate with the land of the living. The most famous method? A bell. Just a small one, attached to a string, tied to the person's hand. If you woke up and moved, even a little, it would ring. Above ground, a little bell mounted on the headstone would jingle, alerting the world that someone down there was not quite ready to rest. It sounds adorable until you realize this bell is your only lifeline. If it falls off your finger, gets tangled, or the string snaps, you're stuck. No extra lives. No second chances. Just you, a malfunctioning bell, and 6 feet of soil. Fun. And don't think for a second that people didn't actually hear these bells. There are reports, many of them disputed, but some well documented, of cemetery workers being roused by the faint jingle of a grave bell. One undertaker claimed he dug up a coffin in response to the sound, only to find claw marks on the inside and a broken string. The bell, still there, just out of reach. Someone had tried. Too little, too late. Of course, inventors weren't satisfied with a basic bell. That's kid stuff. They started adding bells to levers, to pulleys, even to flag systems that would pop up like a periscope when activated from below. One patent included a spring-loaded arm that would shoot a flag into the air like a macabre jack-in-the-box. Surprise! Not dead. But what if no one was around to hear the bell? Another inventor proposed employing Grave guards. People paid to sit around cemeteries and listen for bells all night long. Imagine being that guy. You clock in, settle into a creaky wooden chair, and just wait. Every tiny sound could be your next shift into action, or just the wind messing with your nerves. The fringe detail of this little bell-ringing era? In 1899, a man named Count Karnaskarnicki created what might be the fanciest safety coffin of all time. It had a glass viewing panel, an air tube, and even a speaking trumpet. Yes, a literal megaphone connecting the coffin to the surface. So instead of a faint bell, you'd just shout, "Little help down here." He even demonstrated it by pretending to die and having himself buried, in front of a crowd. 10 minutes later, he shouted up the tube and was dramatically rescued. It was half science, half theatre, and all very, very extra. Still, the biggest question remains. Did any of these things work? That's where it gets murky. There are no definitive records of someone being saved just because their safety coffin worked as intended. Some stories claim success, but documentation is scarce. The best evidence we have is indirect, cases where people were found having tried, and failed, to use the bell or flag system. It proves they woke up. It doesn't prove they made it. Modern scholars are divided. Some argue the bells were purely symbolic, a way for grieving families to feel like they were protecting their loved ones, even after death. Others say that's too cynical, and that these inventions were genuinely meant to work. Still, everyone agrees on one thing. The sheer volume of patents and devices shows how real the fear was. Now, if you're wondering why this idea eventually faded out, it's simple. Better medicine. By the early 20th century, stethoscopes were standard. Doctors could more reliably detect heartbeats and respiration. The margin of error got smaller. Fear didn't vanish, but it became irrational again, rather than justified. But some families still requested safety measures. There are documented burials as late as the 1930s where a string and bell system was included at the family's insistence. And to this day, certain novelty coffins include escape hatches, just in case. Is it necessary? Not really. Is it creepy? Definitely. But also, kind of sweet. Let's pause for a moment and appreciate how weirdly human this all is. We fear death. We fear being forgotten. And we really, really fear being misunderstood, especially if the misunderstanding involves nails and soil. So what do? We build bells. We write detailed funeral instructions. We make sure someone's listening. That's not just survival instinct. That's the need to be heard, even in our silence. And of course, Victorian anxiety didn't stop at bells. They added windows to coffins, little portholes so someone could peek in and double-check. They designed mechanisms that would open the coffin if the occupant started thrashing. One design involved a spring-loaded lid, triggered by a hidden button inside the coffin. Think James Bond, but slightly more horizontal. Even the terminology evolved. The word taphophobia emerged in the 19th century, describing the specific fear of being buried alive. It was recognized as a genuine psychological condition, not just a weird quirk, and taphophobia sufferers were known to carry signed letters that read, "Do not bury me for at least 3 days. I might just be unconscious." It's like a medical bracelet, but written in pure, panicked prose. And here's your nightly callback. Remember that funeral mirror from earlier? In one infamous case, the mirror did fog slightly, but the doctor blamed it on humidity. The family insisted on a bell. The bell rang. The person lived. Maybe. That part is debated. But still, good instincts, right? As you're sinking deeper into your pillow tonight, remember this. There was a time when death wasn't so cut and dry. When people hedged their bets. When coffins came with emergency exits, and cemeteries had more bells than churches. It's ridiculous. It's heartbreaking. And it's kind of beautiful. So if you ever find yourself designing a coffin, hopefully just for fun, maybe add a little bell. You probably won't need it. But if you do, let it ring. So, we've covered the bells, the whistles, the ladders, the glass viewing panels, and all the coffin innovations of the not-so-dead. But tonight, let's take a moment to talk about something that sounds cozy but was actually kind of horrifying. The wake. You know, the family gathering where everyone stands around looking sad and whispering that the dearly departed looks so peaceful. Well, it wasn't just a moment of remembrance. It was insurance. Tonight, we're unpacking the origin of the Irish wake, and why the real reason everyone was staring at the body wasn't spiritual at all. Imagine it. You're in a tiny stone house in 18th century rural Ireland. The fireplace is crackling, the air is thick with peat smoke, and someone has laid your cousin Declan on the kitchen table. He's covered in a white cloth, a candle flickering near his feet. The family gathers round, not to say goodbye, but to make sure he doesn't, move. Because here's the thing. A wake, originally, wasn't about mourning. It was a vigil. People stayed up through the night, literally watching the body. Thus, wake. They waited. They observed. They whispered. And if anyone saw the corpse twitch, breathe, or sit up, game on. It wasn't about sentiment. It was about surveillance. And yes, you're probably wondering, how often did someone actually wake up during their wake? Well, it happened often enough to keep the tradition alive. Pun very much intended. These weren't rare flukes. They were legitimate concerns. If the person had fainted, gone into shock, or suffered from conditions like catalepsy, they could appear totally lifeless while still being very much in there. And let's not forget alcohol. Oh yes, the Irish wake had plenty of that. Traditionally, whiskey was passed around freely, both to honor the departed and to keep everyone awake. If you've ever been to an Irish gathering, you know the line between grief and rowdy storytelling gets blurry fast. 1 minute someone's weeping. The next, they're telling a funny story about the time the deceased fell into a cow trough. It's emotional whiplash, but it keeps people engaged and awake, which, ironically, was the point. Some scholars think the Irish were ahead of the curve on this. While other cultures rushed to bury their dead quickly, thanks to religion, hygiene fears, or sheer habit, the Irish paused. They gave the body time, not just to be mourned, but to be watched. Some even left coins on the eyes, not for the ferryman, but because it was a tactile way to check for facial movement. A twitching eyelid could shift a coin. Talk about lo-fi life signs. Here's your fringe detail for tonight. In certain parts of Ireland, there were documented wake games. Yes, games. Once the initial shock of death had passed and the whiskey started flowing, guests would play cards, tell jokes, and sometimes even dance, all in the same room as the corpse. The logic. Death was a part of life. But the subconscious reason? Keep people alert. Distract them from fear. And, make sure the corpse didn't sit up mid-sentence. But the wake wasn't just Irish. Other cultures had similar practices. In Italy, it was common to leave the body in the family home for days, partially to accommodate faraway relatives, but also because, say it with me, we weren't sure they were actually dead. In parts of India, families still observe the body for an extended period before final rites, partly out of respect, partly out of caution. So while Ireland gets the most attention for the wake, it wasn't a uniquely Celtic anxiety. And what about the Catholic Church? Historically, it had mixed feelings. On one hand, It appreciated the solemnity and the prayers. On the other hand, the drinking, singing, and occasional body poking were seen as undignified. Some priests tried to ban wake traditions entirely, but the people weren't having it. You bury our cousin without checking if he twitches? Not happening, Father O'Leary. Now, let's talk about what happened when someone did wake up. There are documented cases where the dead suddenly sneezed, coughed, or sat bolt upright mid-wake. Panic would erupt. People would scream. Someone would drop a bottle. And then, immediate re-evaluation. Sometimes a second doctor was summoned. Sometimes the family just decided, well, I guess we'll try again next week. One famously spooky story from the 19th century tells of a man in County Cork who died during a typhoid outbreak. He was laid out on the table for his wake, but right before burial, his brother noticed his pinky finger twitching. Everyone rushed to his side. The doctor was called, and sure enough, he was alive. He lived another 7 years, and reportedly never stopped talking about it. And here's the historical debate. Was the wake a form of community bonding, or just medical overcompensation? Some scholars argue it was social glue, a ritual that helped rural communities grieve together, share stories, and pass on oral histories. Others see it as pure, unfiltered survival strategy. If you're not 100% sure they're dead, don't bury them. Either way, it worked. If someone was only mostly dead, they had a window of time to come back. Even today, traces of the wake tradition survive. In some cultures, people still sit with the body for hours or days. Not because they expect movement, but because, deep down, that ancient fear hasn't fully gone away. You'll still hear people say things like, they just look like they're sleeping. It's not just poetic. It's suspicious optimism. And yes, there's always that one cousin at every wake who pokes the body. Just making sure, they'll say with a nervous chuckle. But somewhere in their DNA is the memory of a time when people really did open their eyes at the wrong moment. As you relax into the softness of your sheets tonight, picture the old stone cottage, the flicker of candlelight, the clink of glasses, the whispers, the laughter, the shared fear, buried under stories and songs, and the subtle, ever-watchful glances toward the body in the center of it all. Because maybe, just maybe, they'll wake up. So far, we've talked about people being mistaken for dead, waking up in coffins, and being watched for twitches during candlelit vigils. But what if the twist was intentional? What if someone faked their death on purpose? Welcome to the shadowy world of faux funerals, disappearing acts, and vanishing romantics. Tonight, we explore the people who didn't just wake up during their own wake. They planned it. Let's start with the basics. Faking your death, sometimes called pseudocide, isn't just for spy movies or TV dramas. It's been around for centuries. And unlike those unfortunate folks who got buried alive by mistake, these people wanted everyone to think they were dead. For love, for freedom, for money, or just because they were very tired of their families. One of the oldest recorded examples dates back to 14th century Italy, where a nobleman named Bartolomeo supposedly faked his death to escape a political marriage. He arranged for a funeral, slipped out a side door, and spent the rest of his days disguised as a monk. No one recognized him until he confessed on his actual deathbed, decades later. Bold move, Bart. But he's not alone. The 18th and 19th centuries saw a spike in death-faking cases, mostly thanks to stricter laws, debtors' prisons, and the rise of life insurance. Ah yes, the magical promise of getting paid when someone dies. It's enough to make a few morally flexible folks suddenly pass away, only to be discovered sipping rum on a beach in the Bahamas under a new name. Tragic. One fringe case from 1823 involves a British actor named Thomas Wainwright. He faked his own death to dodge creditors, then tried to collect on life insurance policies from beyond the grave. When his plan unraveled, he claimed it was all performance art. That's either brilliant or just delusional, depending on your tolerance for interpretive theater. Of course, faking death wasn't easy. You needed a convincing corpse, or at least a way to disappear without leaving a body. In some cases, people would bribe a doctor to sign a death certificate. Yes, even back then, corruption was available for the right price. In others, the dead person would vanish in a natural disaster or during war, when paperwork got messy and no one asked too many questions. And it wasn't just men pulling this stunt. Women did it too, often to escape abusive marriages or societal expectations. One woman in early 19th century France staged her own death during childbirth, only to reappear 6 years later in another city with a new name and a bakery business. Her secret? She'd paid a midwife to swap her out with a stillborn baby. Dark. Yes. Clever. Also yes. Then there's the even weirder category. People who faked death for fun. No, really. One eccentric German baron reportedly held his own wake just to hear what people would say about him. He laid in the coffin with his eyes closed, listening to every compliment and eulogy, then resurrected himself mid-toast. The guests screamed. The baron was delighted, and he still made everyone finish their drinks. Now for the scholarly debate. Were these faked deaths more common than we think, or just better documented in colorful cases? Some historians argue that thousands of people successfully disappeared this way, especially in times of war or chaos. Others say it's more myth than reality, that most people who tried were caught, arrested, or failed to disappear for good. After all, it's not easy to reinvent yourself in a small town where everyone knows what your ears look like. And if you're wondering whether faking your death ever worked long-term, sometimes, yes. There are verified stories of individuals who lived decades under assumed names, their true identity only discovered after they passed away again, this time for real. In one case from the early 1900s, a man declared dead in London was later found living in Argentina under a suspiciously similar name. When asked why he did it, he simply replied, "I was bored." There's also the dark flip side, people wrongly accused of faking their death. One case in 1874 involved a man in Boston who collapsed in the street, was taken to the hospital, and eventually declared dead. He was buried. Years later, a man with a striking resemblance appeared in another city. Locals swore it was him. The man denied everything. Scholars still argue over whether it was a doppelganger or a scam gone perfectly. The psychology behind death fakery is fascinating. Some do it to escape shame, financial ruin, social disgrace, or impending prison time. Others do it out of desperation. And then there's a fringe group who claim it's an art form, a way of reclaiming control over their own story. "You don't get to bury me," they seem to say. "I'll do it myself." And if you think this phenomenon is purely historical, think again. Modern stories of pseudocide still pop up, usually involving staged accidents, forged documents, and suddenly found bodies. The internet makes it harder to disappear, but also makes it easier to create a new identity. Some people fake death to avoid student loans. Others do it to start over after social media scandals. The motivations haven't changed, just the tools. But back in the era of handwritten letters and ink-blotted registries, faking your death wasn't just a last resort. It was sometimes your only option. The justice system was slow. Divorce was rare. Bankruptcy was shameful. And if you were a woman, escaping a bad situation legally was nearly impossible. Sometimes the only way out was a way down. Here's tonight's callback. Remember the safety coffins and their bells? There are a few recorded incidents where someone faked their death so well, their family actually installed one of those bells. Just in case. The irony. They weren't planning on waking up by accident. They planned to get out once the coast was clear. One guy allegedly rang his bell a few hours after burial, was rescued, and played the whole thing off as a miracle. It was only years later someone found the receipt for the coffin with the custom bell specs written in his handwriting. So as you lie there tonight, safe and real and unburied, think about the people who disappeared into the margins of history, on purpose. The ones who made themselves ghosts just to escape being trapped, and who, maybe, just maybe, are still out there. Close your eyes. It's quiet. Too quiet. The world is muffled, like you're underwater. You try to move your arms, but there's no space. You breathe, but the air is hot, stale, thin, and that's when you realize it. You're in a box. A real one. You're underground. And this is not a drill. Tonight, we explore the psychological horror of waking up in your coffin, and the rare, chilling stories from people who live to talk about it. Let's start with the sensation itself. Being conscious inside a coffin is like being trapped in the scariest version of a sensory deprivation tank. You can't see. You can't fully breathe. You're surrounded by darkness and silence and the tight press of wood. It's claustrophobia turned up to 11. Even if you're not fully aware of where you are, your body knows something is wrong. Your heart races. You sweat. You try to scream, but the sound dies in your throat. This isn't just hypothetical. There are multiple cases, scattered through history, of people actually surviving premature burial, at least long enough to describe the experience. One of the most famous stories is that of Angelo Hayes, a French teenager buried after a motorcycle accident in 1937. He was declared dead. No pulse, cold skin, no response, and buried. But 3 days later, officials ordered his body exhumed for an insurance investigation. To everyone's shock, Angelo was alive. Barely. He'd fallen into a deep coma, his body in a state of suspended animation. He later described vague memories of waking up in darkness, confusion, and not being able to move. That coffin had nearly become his tomb, and not metaphorically. Then there's the equally eerie case of Filomena Rotundo in the 1860s. Her family, convinced she'd succumbed to a fever, laid her out for a wake. But halfway through the vigil, she reportedly sat up, eyes wide open, and took a gasping breath. The guests screamed. The priest dropped his prayer book. And Filomena? She fainted again from the shock. She survived, but only because the wake was long enough to catch the mistake. And it's not just historical drama. In 2014, a 91-year-old Polish woman was declared dead after collapsing at home. She was placed in the morgue. 11 hours later, workers found her awake in the body bag, cold but breathing. Her first request? Hot tea. Honestly, mood. These rare survivors give us a glimpse into something few others could describe, and every one of them talks about that moment of waking. The confusion, the tightness, the dread. There's no clear thought like, "Oh no, I'm buried alive." It's more primal. It's the body recognizing danger, even when the brain can't yet name it. But what actually happens to your body during burial? If you're conscious in a standard wooden coffin, there's a limited window for survival, typically an hour or two. The biggest threat isn't lack of food or movement. It's carbon dioxide. With every breath, you're recycling the same stale air. The oxygen level drops. Your brain fogs. You might pass out. And by the time anyone realizes, it's too late. Modern forensic experts say that most people buried alive wouldn't die screaming. They'd die drifting. Light-headedness, drowsiness, a slow fade. It's tragic, but it's also the tiniest bit comforting, right? If you had to go, at least you'd go dreaming. Still, the idea of regaining awareness inside a box strikes a primal nerve in all of us. Taphophobia, the fear of being buried alive, isn't just rare, it's universal. You don't need a traumatic experience to fear it. You just need imagination. And maybe a few too many late-night history stories. Oops. Here's a fringe twist for you. Some cultural traditions actually embraced the idea of burial as a kind of trial. In certain spiritual practices, being placed in a confined space was a way to simulate death, to reach enlightenment. You weren't buried under earth, necessarily, but enclosed, cut off from the world, left to face yourself. It was meant to create rebirth, not panic, which sounds lovely. Until you remember that sometimes people forgot to come back and check. And now for the scholarly debate of the hour. Are there cases we'll never know about? People who woke up, struggled, and died again, without leaving a single clue? Some say yes. That soil compression can prevent a body from moving visibly. That wood coffins, especially older, cheaper ones, collapse quickly under pressure. There might be no scratch marks, no broken lids, just silence, and an eerie stillness no one questions. One doctor in the early 1900s, writing anonymously in a medical journal, claimed he once exhumed a body for a coroner's review and found it face down. The original burial report said the man had been carefully arranged. No signs of robbery, no tampering, just flipped over. The doctor didn't tell the family. He simply added it to the growing pile of evidence that sometimes death wasn't as final as it seemed. Let's loop back to the emotional side for a second. Imagine being one of the lucky few who made it out. What do you do with the rest of your life? How do you sleep? How do you explain that you were buried alive and somehow lived? Most of these survivors suffered long-term anxiety, insomnia, and in some cases, deep depression. Because when you've faced the worst way to go, everything else feels too close. And some leaned into the drama. Angelo Hayes, once recovered, became a minor celebrity. He invented his own high-tech coffin with built-in survival features. He toured schools, warning children to double-check your doctor's work. Honestly, iconic. Tonight's callback. Remember that creepy aristocrat who faked his death to listen in on his wake? He later claimed that the scariest part wasn't lying still. It was realizing how quickly people moved on. That's another layer of the fear. Being forgotten, assumed gone, mourned too quickly. Not just buried in wood, but buried in memory. So if you're ever at a wake, and the body twitches, maybe don't scream right away. Maybe wait a beat. Look closer. Whisper their name. And if their eyes snap open, offer them tea. Apparently, that's the traditional request. As you fall asleep tonight, let your limbs go soft and heavy. Sink into your mattress, not dirt. Breathe deep. There's no box around you. No silence pressing in. Just the sound of your own breath, steady and strong. And if you hear scratching, well, probably just the cat. You're still with me, brave. Or maybe just very, very sleepy. Either way, let's shift from the freshly buried to the long preserved. Because tonight, we're wandering into the dry, dusty realm of mummies, medical marvels, and the deeply uncomfortable question: what exactly counts as dead when the body still looks so alive? It starts, as many weird stories do, in ancient Egypt. Mummification wasn't just about religious tradition. it was a technological flex. Egyptians believed preserving the body was essential for the soul's journey in the afterlife. So they dried you out, packed you up, and sometimes even painted on makeup. The result? A face that, centuries later, still looked mildly annoyed. Resting mummy face, we'll call it. But beyond the religious rituals, mummification created an illusion that maybe the person wasn't completely gone. Some ancient tombs held mummies that appeared lifelike, their eyes still wide, their features intact. For visitors unaccustomed to preservation, this wasn't awe-inspiring, it was unsettling. You didn't feel like you were visiting the dead. You felt like you were being watched. Fast forward to the Renaissance, and the fascination only grew. Mummified bodies were shipped to Europe, where they became curiosities in cabinets of wonder. People believed mummies had healing powers. Ground-up mummy powder was actually sold as medicine. That's right. Folks snorted ancient kings because someone said it cured headaches. Can't believe that one didn't make it into modern pharmaceutical ads. Ask your doctor if farrow dust is right for you. But then things got weirder. The more scientists and doctors examined preserved bodies, the more they questioned the boundary between death and life. In the 1700s, medical schools used mummies and embalmed corpses to study anatomy. And every once in a while, someone would point to a body and whisper, "You sure this one's finished?" The 19th century brought formaldehyde and new embalming methods, turning funerals into freeze frames. Families could visit their deceased relatives days or even weeks later, and sometimes the bodies looked better than they had when alive. Rouged cheeks, glossy skin, neatly combed hair. If you didn't know better, you'd think they were napping. In one documented case from 1889, a man in Pennsylvania was embalmed so perfectly that he became a local legend. People traveled from other towns just to see the sleeping man. He was placed in a glass-topped coffin, displayed in a funeral parlor for over 50 years. At that point, it was less about mourning and more like checking in on a particularly quiet neighbor. Let's toss in a fringe fact. In early 20th century Russia, Lenin's body was preserved after death using a top-secret process involving chemicals and temperature control. To this day, he's still lying in a Moscow mausoleum, face serene, mustache sharp. He's had more touch-ups than most celebrities. The scientists maintaining him treat it like an art project, one that never ends. But with each case like this, the same quiet fear crept in. If a body can look this good after death, what if it isn't really dead? Or what if it wasn't when the process began? Historians still argue over this one. Embalming doesn't actually require a medical declaration of death, and especially in earlier centuries, the embalmer wasn't always a doctor. Just a guy with access to chemicals and zero patience for double-checking. There are scattered stories, again rare but deeply disturbing, of people waking up during the early stages of preparation. One account from 1902 describes a woman in Italy who gasped just as the undertaker inserted the trocar. Everyone screamed. The embalmer fainted. The woman lived, and hopefully changed her will. Then there's the chilling story of Elmer McCurdy, a failed outlaw who died in 1911 and was embalmed with such an unusually strong solution that he didn't decompose at all. His body was sold to carnivals and funhouses, passed around like a novelty. For decades. It wasn't until 1976, when a TV crew filming in a haunted house bumped into a mannequin and broke off his arm, that they realized this wasn't a prop. It was Elmer, still wearing a bullet wound. That story made headlines, but it also made people wonder. How many other bodies out there had passed as something else? Art installations, medical models, wax figures that, oops, weren't wax at all. Let's jump into the scholarly debate of the night. Does the preservation of the body prolong some mysterious spark of life? Most experts say no. Once brain activity ceases and oxygen stops flowing, you're gone. But some fringe theorists, yes, they exist, believe that certain states of extreme preservation might slow cellular breakdown so much that a person could technically remain alive in some micro way. It's not science, but it's a fun thought experiment. Or nightmare fuel, depending on your vibe. And don't forget, not all preserved bodies are intentional. There are natural mummies, bodies buried in bogs or caves where temperature and moisture created accidental preservation. Some of these corpses look almost untouched, even after centuries. The famous Tolland man, discovered in a Danish peat bog, still had visible eyelashes. If you ever want to ruin someone's nap, show them a photo of that. What makes these cases so haunting is the liminality. They sit in that uncanny valley between life and death. They challenge the tidy narrative that death is a moment, a line, a yes or no box. These bodies say, maybe not. They whisper, what if? And that whisper gets louder when you think about the rituals we build around death. The need to see the body, to touch the hand, to say goodbye to a face that still looks so familiar. It's not closure, it's confirmation. It's a way to tell ourselves, yes, they're really gone, but what if the body says otherwise? Tonight's callback. Remember those coffins with glass panels? They weren't just for aesthetics. Some were used to recheck the body after burial, just in case. Visitors could walk by and peek in, make sure everything stayed still. In some towns, people made a habit of it. A strange little cemetery stroll, like visiting the zoo. But the animals never move, unless, they do. So tonight, as you fall asleep, think about the stillness that isn't always final, the bodies that refused to rot, the faces that lingered, and the quiet question that lives at the edge of science, faith, and fear. What does it really mean to be dead? Now exhale. You're safe, definitely warm, definitely breathing, and there's no linen wrapping you from head to toe. Yet, by now, you've probably realized that being buried alive was mostly an accident, or a panic-fueled mistake. But tonight, we're cracking open a tomb of a different flavor. People who volunteered to be buried. On purpose. For money. For fame. For spiritual growth. Or just because they really didn't think it through. Welcome to the wild world of self-burial, escapology, and spiritualists with deep commitment issues. Let's begin with the obvious. This was never a good idea. Not even once. But it happened anyway. From the 19th century onward, there were daredevils and illusionists who made burial their gimmick. Think of it as extreme sports for the coffin crowd. They called themselves human moles, buried alive acts, or coffin dwellers. And crowds ate it up. Because who doesn't want to pay a nickel to watch a guy go underground and maybe come back? One of the most famous self-buriers was a man named Harry Houdini. Not for doing it, but for being begged repeatedly to try. Houdini, master of escapes and publicity stunts, considered being buried alive as the ultimate test. In 1915, he attempted it. He was placed in a coffin 6 feet underground with a small breathing pipe. But something went wrong. The soil collapsed. Houdini had to claw his way out, nearly suffocating in the process. He survived, barely, and swore he'd never try it again. Smart man. But other performers weren't so lucky, or cautious. In 1927, a man named Sigmund Breitbart, known as the Iron King, attempted a buried-alive stunt where he was sealed in a metal coffin under cement. The crowd loved it, until he didn't resurface. The air system had failed. He died before the show could end. People thought it was part of the act. The ultimate tragic encore. And then there's the fringe case of Sadhu Haridas, an Indian yogi who, in 1837, was reportedly buried in a sealed underground chamber for 40 days, with no food, water, or air. Witnesses claimed he survived through meditation and breath control. British officers overseeing the stunt were both amazed and confused. Some believed it was fakery. Others thought he'd entered a state of suspended animation. To this day, scholars argue over whether it was a clever trick, a hoax, or an unexplainable physiological feat. Whatever it was, it made Sadhu Haridas an underground legend. Literally. But self-burial wasn't always for applause. Sometimes it was for belief. Certain spiritualists and mystics saw being buried alive as a path to enlightenment, a symbolic death and rebirth. They believed that by experiencing the tomb, they could shed ego, reach a higher consciousness, or even commune with spirits, which is beautiful in theory, terrible in execution. In the early 20th century, a Russian mystic named Alexei Romanov claimed he could survive 3 days underground without oxygen as a form of soul purification. He was buried in a pine box in his follower's backyard, complete with a breathing tube and candles. Day 1 passed. Day 2, the candles went out. Day 3, silence. When they opened the grave, they found a very peaceful, very dead mystic. His followers called it a transition. Critics called it exactly what it was. Here's your fringe detail of the night. In 1968, an artist named Michael J. O'Hare actually applied for a permit in California to be buried alive for 7 days as an art installation. He called it Subterranean Performance No. 1. The city said absolutely not. Something about health codes, lawsuits, and common sense. Party poopers. So why do people do this? Psychologists think it comes down to control. Death is the ultimate uncertainty. But if you choose to simulate it, on your own terms, you reclaim a little power. You decide when and how you go in, and, hopefully, when and how you come out. It's also the same impulse behind skydiving, deep-sea diving, or walking on hot coals. The flirtation with danger. The illusion that you're invincible. And then, of course, there's the publicity. In the golden age of freak shows and sideshows, being buried alive was a guaranteed ticket seller. Some performers advertised themselves as the human corpse, lying in a coffin in store windows or circus tents for hours or days. People lined up to peer through glass, tap on the lid, whisper jokes. It was creepy. It was lucrative. And yes, it was usually not fully underground. Most of these stunts involved shallow graves or partial burials with hidden air vents and snacks, because even the undead get hungry. Still, some artists took it seriously. In 1994, performance artist Teching C planned a piece where he would be buried for an entire year. The project was eventually abandoned, probably because, well, obviously, but the fact that someone even considered it shows just how far people will go to explore death without dying. Tonight's scholarly debate: could any of these buried alive stunts actually be survivable long-term? Most scientists say no. The human body can only go without oxygen for minutes, and even with an air supply, confinement, darkness, and isolation quickly lead to panic, disorientation, and hallucinations. But some researchers believe that in rare meditative states, like those claimed by yogis, metabolism can slow dramatically. There's no definitive proof, just mystery, and a lot of very still bodies. And let's not forget the ones who didn't make it back. One self-proclaimed illusionist in 1933 tried to beat the world record for being underground, 10 days in a coffin, buried in sand. The air system clogged on day 4. His final words, scribbled on the lid. Still breathing. Help. That lid now sits in a museum. A haunting artifact of ambition, ego, and one really bad bet. Even today, echoes of this exist. You'll find YouTubers who attempt buried alive challenges, in controlled, well-ventilated setups, of course. They lie in plexiglass boxes, film themselves, act spooked. It's not real danger, but it taps into that same primal thrill. The what if, the slow press of dirt, the idea that you might hear footsteps above, and no one's digging you out. Tonight's callback. Remember the guy who installed bells in his coffin as a prank? Well, in one bizarre twist of history, someone actually tried to combine self-burial and bell ringing. A 19th century performer in Ohio had himself buried with a large, manual bell system and 2 assistants stationed above ground. The plan was to ring the bell every hour for 24 hours, then emerge dramatically. He rang the bell 3 times, passed out from heat and claustrophobia, and had to be pulled out mid-performance. He claimed it was all part of the show. His manager did not agree. So as you relax into your blanket tonight, think about the people who willingly chose the box, who traded applause for air, who believed that death could be danced with, controlled, even tamed, and who, more often than not, miscalculated. Sleep safe. Don't try this at home. So far, we've trudged through real cases, strange devices, and even people willing to be buried for fun. But now, let's wander into the foggy corner of history where myth and reality get so tangled, even the dead can't tell them apart. Tonight, we're uncovering cemetery legends that turned out to be alarmingly true. It all starts with whispers, a local tale about a crypt where the coffins move on their own, a grave that seems to crack open every few years, a body that just won't stay put. You've heard these stories before, maybe around a campfire, maybe from your grandma, and most of them, just stories. Except, some aren't. Let's talk about the Chase Vault, one of the most infamous and baffling cemetery legends in the Western Hemisphere. Located in Barbados, the Chase Vault was a large stone crypt meant to house a wealthy family. But soon after the first few burials, something strange started happening. When the crypt was reopened for additional interments, the coffins inside were found to have moved. Not just shuffled slightly, flung around the room. Heavy lead coffins, weighing hundreds of pounds, tossed as if by some invisible hand. Every time the crypt was opened, it was the same scene. Chaos. The doors were sealed tight. No sign of tampering. Eventually, the colonial governor ordered the vault permanently closed. It remains sealed to this day. Historians still argue over this one. Some say it was flooding. Others think it was gas buildup. A few blame pranksters. But the truth, no one knows. And yes, it's been checked. No trapdoors. No hidden tunnels. Just stone walls, a slab of history, and the unsettling possibility that something inside really didn't want to stay still. Then there's the case of the screaming mummies. Sounds like a metal band, I know, but this one's real. In several archaeological digs across Egypt and South America, bodies have been found with their mouths wide open in expressions of agony. Theories vary. Some say it's rigor mortis, locking the jaw mid-scream. Others suggest these people were buried alive or died in pain. And while science offers logical explanations, like muscle contraction during death, you can't help but shiver when you look at those faces. They don't look peaceful. They look like they were trying to tell us something. Here's your fringe fact. In the 1800s, there was a cemetery in New England where locals believed a vampire was buried. Multiple family members had died in quick succession. Classic tuberculosis. but the townsfolk blamed the undead. So they exhumed one of the recently buried daughters, found her unusually preserved, and burned her heart on a rock in front of the community. That's not legend. That's documented. They even named the rock. It's still there. But myths weren't limited to rural towns. Even in major cities, people passed down stories of restless graves. In London's Highgate Cemetery, rumours spread in the 1970s of a vampire. Yes, a proper cape-wearing, thong-having vampire, seen wandering near the tombs. Local kids dared each other to sleep near the mausoleums. Paranormal investigators got involved. And one night, a group broke into a crypt and claimed to find signs of movement inside. Police eventually had to intervene. Was it a vampire? Probably not. Was it definitely not a vampire? That's harder to say. Let's not forget the infamous bell graves. We've already talked about safety coffins, but some stories tell of bells ringing after the body was long presumed gone. One churchyard in Pennsylvania reportedly heard its grave bell ring during a thunderstorm. No wind, no animals, just one long, clear chime. When they dug up the grave, they found the string snapped, and the hand clenched tight around it. And then there's the recurring theme of graves that open themselves. In parts of Eastern Europe, villagers reported graves that cracked or exploded, sometimes with a foul smell, sometimes not. The explanations range from soil movement to gas buildup to burial errors. But in some cases, they found signs of movement. Coffins turned, clothes torn, eyes open. These weren't horror stories. These were coroner reports. Here's tonight's scholarly debate. Are these cemetery myths exaggerated accounts of real phenomena, or misunderstood science wrapped in superstition? Anthropologists argue both sides. Some say it's just post-mortem changes, gases shifting bodies, pressure cracking tombs. Others believe these myths serve a social function. They give communities a way to process grief and fear. But a handful say, maybe some of these cases really are unexplainable. Like the crypt in Louisiana, where multiple coffins were sealed in cement, only to be found rotated 180 degrees weeks later. The seals? Untouched. The locals? Nervous. The records? Still open for interpretation. Or the 19th century British family who buried their patriarch with his favorite pocket watch. Months later, the grave was reopened for a second burial, and the watch was found on a completely different body. No signs of disturbance. No missing soil. Just a very confused cemetery keeper and two families who never spoke to each other again. And let's not forget the body that won't decay. In the Philippines, the incorruptible corpse of a local priest has become both a religious relic and a scientific mystery. Decades later, his body remains intact. No embalming, no refrigeration. Just still here. Visitors say he smells like flowers. Critics say it's environmental factors. And skeptics, well, they're still poking him. Tonight's callback. Remember those glass-topped coffins and open crypts? One reason they became popular wasn't just aesthetics. It was so people could check on the bodies. Make sure they were still. When a myth got too loud, when a bell rang or a whisper spread, the coffin was opened. Confirmation bias? Maybe. But every once in a while, they found something. So tonight, as you drift into sleep, remember that every myth starts somewhere. Every cemetery story, every whispered tale, every crypt that cracked. Maybe it was just a shift in the soil. Or maybe someone moved. And if you wake up tomorrow and your window's open when you swore you closed it, probably the wind. Probably. By now, you've walked the graveyard paths, peeked into coffins, heard the bells, and seen the scratch marks. But even with modern medicine, airtight diagnoses, and state-of-the-art embalming, there's something that still lingers in the back of our collective mind. What if they got it wrong? Tonight, we examine why, even now, the fear of premature burial still haunts us. Let's be clear. The odds of being buried alive today are nearly non-existent. Hospitals run tests. Death certificates require multiple sign-offs. Bodies are often monitored for hours, sometimes days, before burial or cremation. And yet, the fear hasn't died. It just changed costumes. You see it in horror films. One of the most effective horror tropes: waking up in a coffin. Directors know exactly what they're doing. Whether it's a hand bursting from the soil or a character clawing at wood in the dark, it triggers something ancient. And it works every time. Because buried alive is a universal fear, not just of dying, but of being forgotten, trapped, unheard. And it's not just fiction. News stories still pop up now and then. In 2018, a South African woman was declared dead after a car accident and taken to the morgue. Later, morticians noticed she was breathing. She was rushed to the hospital, stabilized, and survived. The doctors called it a technical error. That's one way to phrase it. In 2020, a man in India was rescued after being buried alive by relatives who mistook his catalepsy for death. He was unconscious, stiff and pale, but alive. He later joked that he felt like a potato in a sack. That's either the best coping mechanism or the world's darkest stand-up routine. Here's the fringe case. In Brazil, 2022, a woman was found buried alive after a home invasion. The attackers wanted to make sure she wouldn't talk, and buried her in a shallow grave in the woods. She survived. She crawled out. She identified her attackers. And somehow, the press still ran with the headline, "Buried alive woman crawls free." As if that's just a casual Tuesday. What makes these cases so disturbing is how they echo the old fears. Misdiagnosis. False assumptions. The body mistaken for a corpse. The return from the grave. Only now, instead of chalky doctors with mirrors and vinegar, it's paramedics with heart monitors and certifications. We want to believe the system works. But these stories remind us, sometimes it doesn't. Let's talk about the psychology behind it. Taphophobia, the fear of being buried alive, remains one of the most deeply rooted human anxieties. And not just for the claustrophobic. It combines three primal fears: loss of control, isolation, and conscious death. Add darkness and silence, and your brain starts playing its own horror movie. And despite everything we know, science, statistics, safety protocols, we still check. Funeral directors double confirm. Nurses call doctors again. Families request open casket ceremonies, just to be sure. Because while the body might be still, the fear is alive and well. Here's tonight's scholarly debate. Is this fear purely evolutionary or culturally taught? Some psychologists argue it's innate, a leftover survival mechanism from our earliest ancestors, who feared being trapped in caves or crushed in landslides. Others say the rise of taphophobia aligns with literature, media, and urban legends. Basically, blame Edgar Allan Poe. He wrote about premature burial so vividly that generations grew up assuming it could happen to anyone, which, for a while, was true. But even as we've grown safer, the stories haven't stopped. If anything, they've evolved. Now we worry about being buried in a system, overlooked, unnoticed. It's not about literal soil. It's about being declared something we're not, too soon, without consent. Being buried alive is the metaphor we still carry for being silenced before our time. Take modern crime thrillers. So many plots revolve around mistaken identity, the presumed dead character who comes back for revenge, or dramas where a coma patient wakes up just as the family signs the DNR. These plot lines strike nerves, because somewhere, buried under all our logic, is that flicker of what if they're wrong? And of course, the internet doesn't help. For every article explaining how rare premature burial is, there's a clickbait headline. She woke up in the morgue and what happened next will shock you. Thanks, algorithm. Nothing like a healthy dose of fear with your morning coffee. But what really keeps the fear alive, what gives it teeth, is how final burial feels. Death is often gradual, confusing, sometimes reversible. But once you're buried, that's it. We've sealed the door. The story ends. And the idea that it might not be over yet, that shakes us. Tonight's callback. Remember those bells, those tubes, those flags? We think of them as relics. Silly little contraptions from a paranoid time. But maybe they weren't so silly. Maybe they were an early expression of what we all still want. One last chance to be heard. A fail-safe. A plan B. Just in case. There's also a small but growing trend in funeral design. Living funeral tech. Smart coffins, equipped with sensors that detect movement. Emergency buttons. Some even come with intercom systems or GPS tags. It's not mainstream, but it's out there. And not just for the paranoid. For those who want to control every aspect of their death, including the possibility of being misdiagnosed. And yet, despite all this, we keep going. We trust our doctors. We write our wills. We plan our funerals. Because fear or not, we know one thing. Life moves on. Even when it ends, it carries forward in memory, in legacy, in story. So tonight, as you close your eyes, know this. You are seen. You are not forgotten. And the odds of being buried alive are pretty close to zero. Probably even lower if you don't nap with a blank expression in public. Sleep well. You've earned it. You're still here. Impressive. Or maybe just quietly panicked. But before we drift off completely, we need to face the final chapter of this long, morbid, utterly fascinating tale. The quiet realization that it probably won't happen to you. But it once happened to so many. Tonight, we're wrapping it up. Slowly, gently, one last breath at a time, with a calm understanding of just how far we've come, and how much we've buried along the way. Let's rewind the fear for a moment. Imagine you're living in the 1600s. You fall ill. Your family's whispering. A doctor arrives with a bag that rattles ominously. He takes one look, pokes your arm, nods and leaves. You're still warm, still hearing, but you can't move. You try to scream. Nothing happens. They begin wrapping you in cloth. Someone starts praying. You're lifted, placed into a box, and the lid shuts. That was a real possibility. For centuries. Because we didn't have tools. We didn't understand catalepsy or diabetic comas or shock. We saw stillness and assumed the worst. Then we buried it. Now, picture today. You collapse. Paramedics arrive within minutes. They perform CPR. They use defibrillators. If you still have a pulse, even faint, they'll find it. Machines track your oxygen. Doctors consult charts. Nurses check and double-check. If you're declared dead, it's not just a guess. It's a protocol. In other words, you're not going to wake up inside your own wake. Probably. Still, the fear remains. Why? Maybe because it's less about death, and more about the idea of going unnoticed. Being trapped while everyone assumes you're fine, or gone. It taps into something universal. The desire to be seen, heard, counted. Throughout this series, we've danced with the dead. But really, we've been following the living. Those who built bells into coffins. Those who peeked into crypts, just to check. The ones who sat vigil, whispering prayers and watching for breath. The mourners who couldn't let go without certainty. There's a kindness in that, a tenderness. As bizarre as safety coffins may seem, they were built from love. Desperate, slightly paranoid love, but love nonetheless. Here's your fringe fact for the finale. In Japan, there's a burial ritual called mochitsuki, where family members gently press the abdomen of the deceased with rice paddles to confirm stillness. Not because they expect movement, but because it brings closure, a final touch, a way of saying, yes, they're really gone. And here's tonight's scholarly debate, our last one. Should modern society maintain these rituals, even though we have the science? Some argue yes. That death isn't just clinical, it's emotional. That rituals like wakes, body viewings, even those final mirror checks serve a purpose beyond diagnostics. They make the intangible real. Others say no. That clinging to outdated fears feeds anxiety. That we should move on. Maybe both are right. Maybe it's okay to have machines that tell us when someone's gone, and a little bell on the wrist, just in case. Maybe our fear is less about logic and more about comfort. You've made it through every chapter of this quiet descent. From coffins with snack compartments to yogis in meditative graves. From scratch marks on lids to whispered legends of screaming tombs. And now, here we are. You, in your bed. Alive. Let's not pretend we haven't learned something here. We've learned that people once buried others in haste. That some feared death so much they built traps for it. That others embraced it, crawled into the coffin on purpose, hoping to emerge reborn. We've learned that for centuries, being buried alive wasn't just folklore. It was a terrifyingly normal mistake. And we've learned that even today, with all our science, the fear hasn't really left. It just changed shape. So what now? Now we breathe. In, then out. Let the fear loosen. Let the story settle. Let the sound of this voice become just another hum in the room. The bells have stopped ringing. The dirt is still. The safety tubes are dusty, unused. And you're safe. Wrapped in blankets, not linen. Surrounded by pillows, not wood. You're not 6 feet under. You're here. Above ground, awake, but fading, just one more breath. So you're still awake, or maybe not. Maybe you're drifting in that in-between place, where thoughts aren't quite dreams, and sounds feel like echoes from another room. But if you're still here, hanging on by a thread, let's stretch the thread a little longer. You've earned one last chapter, a soft, sleepy spiral where the lines blur and time loosens its grip. Let's call it the postscript nobody saw coming. Let's revisit something simple. The why behind all this. Why did people get so afraid of being buried alive in the first place? It wasn't just the death. It was the awareness of death. The slow realization. The possibility that you could be sealed away, perfectly conscious, while the world packed the dirt on top. It's a fear that lives in the back of the brain, tapping occasionally when the lights go out. A fear of being ignored, abandoned, misunderstood in your most vulnerable moment. And that fear, it taught us something. It taught us to check, to build fail-safes, to keep watch. It gave us bells and tubes and candles and people poking toes with warm irons. It gave us wakes. It gave us rituals. And in a strange way, it gave us stories like this one. Because fears like that don't just fade. They evolve into folklore, into bedtime tales, into strange, whispery histories passed down in candlelight. But here's a quiet little truth. Those fears, as wild as they were, built our compassion. They taught us to pause, to doubt our own certainty, to keep vigil, even when science says it's safe. They made us gentler, slower, more human. And when we finally learned to diagnose death with accuracy, the fear didn't die. It transformed. It became metaphor. Now we talk about being buried in work, ghosted, left in the dark. See what happened there. The grave became a metaphor for isolation. The casket became a symbol for feeling stuck. And the premature burial? That became a metaphor for being dismissed before your time, before you had a chance to say your piece. It's still here, just in a new costume. Think about how many times you've seen someone passed over, ignored, misjudged, labeled done, when they were only just beginning. We don't bury people in pine boxes anymore. We bury them in silence, in assumptions, in the unwillingness to check one more time. And yet, people still ring bells. Just not the literal kind. Someone speaks up in a meeting and no one hears them. That's a bell. Someone posts a quiet plea online and the algorithm hides it. That's a bell. Someone tries to explain how they're feeling and gets met with, "You're overreacting." Bell. Every time someone's still breathing, still fighting, but the world decides they're already gone, that's a story echoing from a coffin we forgot to open. But here's where it turns. You lying there now, you're not buried, not silenced, not sealed away. You listened. You saw all of this. You stayed awake while generations of fear rose from the grave. You followed every dusty footstep, heard every muffled voice, read every scratched name. And because of that, you've given these stories what they always needed, a witness. So what now? Maybe this isn't the end of a creepy history podcast. Maybe this is a soft, strange meditation on empathy, on remembering that people have been misjudged for centuries, not just in death, but in life. That the act of watching the body, of holding vigil, of checking one last time, is love in its rawest form. And if you take nothing else from this sleepy saga, let it be this: always listen for the bell, not just in graveyards, but in classrooms, in boardrooms, in bedrooms. When someone you love goes quiet, check. When someone's story seems too neat, question it. When someone seems gone, wait. Be the wake. Be the watcher. Be the one who says, "Hang on, not yet. Let's give it one more minute." And if you're ever the one ringing the bell, don't stop. Because someone might be listening. Someone like you. Now, let's close the lid for real. This time without fear, without twitching, without claw marks. Just soft, velvet silence. And the knowledge that, long ago, people like us listened through the dirt and heard something. Your breath is slow now, steady. There's nothing left to be afraid of. The story is quiet. The past is resting. And so can you. All right. Let's stop digging. We've gone deep, really deep, into stories of scratchy coffins, twitchy corpses, unqualified doctors, spiritual show-offs, and bells tied to toes. We've tiptoed through wakes, sat in silence with yogis, and stared at unblinking mummies. We've exhumed every fear and tucked it back in again with a whisper. And now it's time to be still. Not the panicked stillness of a coffin. No, none of that. A different stillness. The good kind. The The kind that hums through your bones when the day has ended and nothing is expected of you. The kind that doesn't need bells or mirrors or flags. Just breath. Just warmth. Just presence. You're here, above ground, in a soft bed, in a safe room, wrapped in cotton and quiet. No one's poking you with hot irons. No one's holding up a mirror to check your breath. The only thing you have to do right now is nothing. Let's walk this final stretch together, slowly. Inhale. Hold it for a second. Let it out, slowly. That's what they call a living breath. One no doctor ever questioned. One that says, I am here. I am now. I am safe. Let your fingers relax. Let your shoulders sink into the pillow. Loosen your jaw. There's nothing to say. No final words. No dramatic exits. Just this long, low exhale as your body releases whatever tension it's still holding. We've wandered through centuries of confusion, through rituals that were equal parts fear and hope. We've seen how the line between life and death was once drawn with chalk, and just as easily wiped away. But you don't live in that world. You live in a world of sensors and scans and 24-hour hospitals. You live in a world where people triple-check, and then check again. So let go of that fear. Not because it's silly, but because you've honored it. You listened. You learned. You saw its face and didn't flinch. That takes courage. And now that it's done, now that the lights are low and the story is told, you can finally put the lid on this thing. Gently, slowly, with love. Let your mind float. Maybe you picture a quiet field. Maybe an ocean. Maybe just darkness. The soft, velvety kind that doesn't feel like absence, but like rest. Like hiding under a blanket when the world is too loud. Let your breath match something rhythmic. Waves, maybe. Or your own heartbeat. Each beat says, I'm here. I'm okay. I'm not buried. I'm blanketed. If your mind drifts, let it. If it loops back to that one story with the bell or the guy who faked his own death, that's okay. Let it loop. It's just a thought. It'll fade. Because here's the truth. Sleep is the kindest version of death we get to practice. And unlike the other one, you wake up from this. Every time. With sun in your window, warmth in your room, and the quiet, silly satisfaction of knowing you made it through a story that scared generations, and turned it into a bedtime tale. So let's stretch this silence. Let's make it feel luxurious. There's no coffin here. No wood. No velvet. Just the faint sound of a fan. Maybe the soft tick of a clock. Maybe nothing at all. You're not being watched. You're not being mistaken. You are entirely, undeniably alive, and entirely allowed to sleep now. If your muscles are still tense, think of them as ropes. Untie them. Start with your toes. Let them go slack. Then your ankles. Then your knees. Imagine them heavy, like they're sinking through the bed. Your chest rises. Your chest falls. No bells ringing, no panic. Just gravity. Just peace. Maybe part of you still clings to the story. That's okay too. Let it flicker like candlelight on the far wall of your mind. Not too bright. Not too scary. Just a reminder that you were here. You heard it. You stayed awake through every creepy detail. And now, you get to drift away while the rest of the world sleeps. That fear, the one hiding in the corners of history, you faced it. You stared it down. And you're still breathing. Still cozy. Still here. Tomorrow, you'll wake up. You'll blink at the ceiling. You might remember bits of this story. Maybe a name, maybe a coffin with a snack drawer. But mostly, you'll remember the quiet. The way your body melted into the sheets. The way the fear lost its edge when you gave it your full attention. Tonight, nothing is chasing you. Nothing is burying you. You are not forgotten. You are not mistaken. You are seen. You are heard. And above all, you are still. Let your breath be the only sound. In, out. Let the edges of your thoughts blur. Let names and dates and coffins and bells slip into fog. You don't need to listen anymore. The story is finished. The last page is turned. There's no epilogue, no twist ending, no final scare. Just this moment. Just this softness. Just this silence. Stay here, if you want. Float. Sleep is not something you fall into. It's something you return to, like a familiar room, waiting with the light off. Go there now. Good night.